During opening statements yesterday, the defense told you that Barbara was not going to talk, and that is why we are all here today. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not the reason that we are here. We are here because Austin Walker, this defendant, secretly entered into the home of Barbara Walker when he wasn't supposed to be there. He moved her into her kitchen after he confronted her. He held a knife to her in front of their 4 very young children. And then he stabbed her 17 times. Now, it has been told to you guys several times that the defendant is charged with 3 counts. He's charged with 1 count of attempted first-degree premeditated murder. He is charged with burglary with an assault or battery. And he is charged with an aggravated assault. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's walk through each of these crimes. To prove to you attempted first-degree murder, the state must prove the following 3 elements to you beyond reasonable doubt. That Austin Walker did some act that was intended to cause the death of Barbara Walker that went beyond just thinking or talking about it. Element 2 is that Austin Walker acted with a premeditated design to kill Barbara Walker. And element 3, that the act would have resulted in the death of Barbara Walker, except that someone prevented him from killing Barbara Walker, or he failed to do so. So let's talk about each of these elements in turn and how the state has proven these to you today. Element 1 is that he did some act that was intended to cause the death of Barbara Walker, and that it went beyond just thinking or talking about it. And ladies and gentlemen, this defendant went well beyond thinking or talking about it. He took affirmative steps to effectuate her death. He stabbed her, as I've said, 17 times. She had multiple injuries that you heard from Dr. Husty that were external, and you saw them yourself in the body camera footage as well as the scarring in all of the photographs. She had the slice wound to the front of her throat, another stab wound to the back of her neck. She had a stab wound to her back, and she had multiple lacerations on her arms and her legs and her stomach. She also had multiple internal injuries, as Dr. Husty explained to you. She had a stab wound to the heart that they had to repair that was causing a large loss of blood. She also had stab wounds to her stomach, which Dr. Husty told you was a through-and-through puncture wound to her stomach, meaning it went all the way through her. She had stab wounds to her intestines, to her liver, and she had 2 stab wounds to her diaphragm. Dr. Husty told you she had 1 on the left and 1 on the right. You also heard that she lost a significant amount of blood. Dr. Husty testified and told you that she had lost 30 to 40% of her blood volume when all of this had happened to her. And I believe he also testified and told you that during surgery at one point they had to give her over 5 liters of blood just to try and supplement and get her through surgery. He also testified and told you that her injuries would have been fatal had they not been treated. So had Barbara not made it to that hospital room, she would have died that night. You also have the defendant's own statements to his father, Randy. He called Randy and told him, "I just killed Barbara." Ladies and gentlemen, this defendant had every intention to let Barbara die that night. He had every intention to kill her. You also heard on Officer Grollo's body camera footage, while the defendant was on the phone with Randy, that he was not going to let fire and rescue in to help treat Barbara and to get her some medical attention. You saw the copious amounts of blood as it was described to you that was at the scene. You saw the very large knife that he used to stab her with. And again, her injuries to her neck, her chest, her stomach. So ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven to you beyond reasonable doubt that first element of attempted first-degree murder. The second element, that he acted with a premeditated design to kill. The judge is going to explain to you what premeditation is, and those instructions are going to tell you that a premeditated design is a conscious decision to kill. And it must be present in the person's mind at the time that the crime was committed. Now, the judge is also going to instruct you that there's no set period of time that has to be in place in order for premeditation to occur. It's not months, it's not weeks, it can be a matter of seconds. But the period of time must be long enough to allow reflection by this defendant. So let's talk about the premeditation that's here today. First off, this defendant entered back into the home of Barbara Walker. You heard from AJ that he watched the defendant leave out the front door. You heard from the defendant himself today that he left the front door and he knew that Barbara was supposed to come back in through the back door. And that's just where he went. He went straight to the laundry room, straight near the door where he knew that Barbara was going to have to come back inside. And he waited for her to enter back into that home. He then grabbed her around her waist after he tried taking her phone from her, and did take her phone from her, and then he carried her, as both children and Barbara explained to you, in a bear hug fashion, where her back was to his chest, and he moved her into the kitchen. All of these steps start leading you towards that premeditation. He also brought a very large knife into the home, as again you guys have seen. He then removed that sheath from that knife. We know the sheath would have been removed because it was laying on the floor near the island, kind of where all of this was going on. You guys would have seen those photos yourself. We also have this incident that happened back in March of 2022, just 2 months before the incident we're here for today took place. And at that time, he went back to Miami, told everyone that he had gone back to Miami. Barbara saw it on the messaging app. Randy had talked to him. The defendant told him he was back in Miami. Yet at some point, the defendant came back up to Jacksonville without anybody knowing about it, and he hid inside of Barbara's house. He was trying, this was his trial run, that's what he was going to do that day. He was going to cause her some sort of harm and some sort of injury, and the only reason he wasn't able to do so is because his dad came in and stopped it. His dad happened to walk in there, and that's the reason that Barbara made it to May. We also have the text messages that the defendant sent to Barbara talking about, it doesn't matter if it's in 10 days, 20 days, 40 days, I can still do it. Now I want to talk about the actual night of the incident, where Barbara testified and told you that after the defendant cut her the first time and she was laying on the ground, he stabbed her. He then walked around the island, looked at the window, sat at the bench, got up, stabbed her again. She testified that he did this to her multiple times, before he called his father. The defendant then called his father. He told his father, I just killed Barbara. Every single time the defendant is walking around, taking a moment, sitting down on the bench, getting back up, stabbing her again, that is premeditation. He is making a conscious decision, a conscious effort to stab her and to kill her. You also have, after he called Randy and told him, I just killed Barbara, he continues to do this again. I believe Barbara told you that it was another at least 3 or 4 times that he continued to circle and pace and stab, and circle and pace and stab, over and over and over again. And he did this, we know, at least 10 times based on Barbara's testimony that he circled and paced and stabbed. And again, his statements to Randy after he made those first cuts. So the state has proven to you that Austin Walker acted with a premeditated design to effectuate the death of Barbara Walker. The third and final element, actually, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, I want to go back to the premeditation for just a moment. One other thing that came up today during the defendant's testimony is the defendant told you what was going through his mind during his version of this event. But one thing that stood out was that he said, she's taking everything. That's what was going through his mind. He was thinking about how she took his kids, and she took his father, and she took his money. He did this with a conscious effort, ladies and gentlemen, because he was mad, because he believed that she was taking everything. The third element is that the act would have resulted in Barbara's death had somebody not prevented Austin Walker from killing her, or he failed to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, again, she had these very serious injuries that would have been fatal according to Dr. Husty. But for AJ, the 8-year-old little boy that was a hero, he ran out of that house, he ran to the neighbor's house, and he told that neighbor what was happening to his mom. AJ helped save his mom's life that day. AJ helped prevent the defendant from killing Barbara. Patrina also had a lot of courage that day. Patrina, not knowing what she could walk into, went over to Barbara's house to make sure everything was okay. Barbara confronted the defendant to find out what was going on. Barbara then returned back to her home and called 911, and it was that action that resulted in the defendant, or law enforcement, showing up and apprehending the defendant before he could actually kill Barbara. You also have Randy's call to 911. His affirmative actions helped prevent Barbara's death and get law enforcement there as quick as possible. And then finally, you have the extensive medical care that she received from Dr. Husty, in that he did everything he could to save her life that night. So ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that those actions of the defendant would have caused Barbara to die, but for someone else's intervention. And that intervention was AJ, Patrina, Randy. Those people helped intervene, and then Dr. Husty took the surgery and saved her life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the judge will instruct you that if you do find the defendant guilty of attempted murder, then you're also going to have to find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was in possession of a weapon, or used or displayed or carried a weapon during the course of the offense. A weapon, as you can see, is defined here for you, that it's an object that's readily capable of inflicting bodily harm. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant had a knife. You all saw the knife. You saw the injuries to Barbara. Of course, the defendant was in possession and used a weapon to effectuate his crime. You're also going to be asked to find, if you find the defendant guilty, to find whether or not it was a family member or household member. Now, the judge is going to instruct you on what that means. There's spouses, persons related by blood or marriage, persons with children in common. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard testimony that Barbara and Austin were married. You heard testimony that they have 4 children together. Ladies and gentlemen, you can find that this was a family or household member. Now, the defense is going to argue to you that the defendant was acting in a heat of passion, and so therefore it was not premeditated. Ladies and gentlemen, these are going to be all of the instructions. The main ones are sudden event, that he was driven by a blind and unreasoning theory, that there was no reasonable amount of time to cool off, and that a reasonable person would have cooled off before committing the act, and that the defendant was so provoked and did not cool off before he committed this act. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a heat of passion. This was not a provoked action. This was a planned attack, because as he told you again today, she took his money, she took his kids, she was taking his father away from him. He said he lost everything. This was not a blind rage. This was someone who was angry and was trying to get back at Barbara. You even heard testimony today that he at one point told, I believe it was Randy, she took my kids, I'll take them from her. This was not a heat of passion, ladies and gentlemen. The judge is also going to instruct you on excusable attempted homicide. There's 3 circumstances that can apply for this. One is an accident or misfortune during a lawful act by lawful means, another accident or misfortune with heat of passion like we just discussed, or an accident and misfortune resulting from sudden combat if a dangerous weapon was not used. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this was not an accident. This wasn't something that, oops, it just happened. This was an actual attempt by the defendant who was affirmative actions and affirmative steps. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is not an excusable attempted homicide. Now, the defense is also going to try and convince you that this was an act of self-defense. You heard the defendant's testimony today that Barbara pulled the knife out on him in the laundry room, and then he grabbed that knife from Barbara and was able to disarm her, and she ran out of there screaming, he's got a knife, he's got a knife. And then she pulled the knife out on him again in the kitchen, and that's how he ended up with the cut to his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a case of self-defense. That testimony does not line up with the testimony of the other witnesses. Both of the children told you that they never saw their mother with a knife. Barbara herself told you that she never had a knife. The only knife that was found in the house was this one. And it was because the defendant brought that knife into the house, not Barbara. And even if for a moment we believe the defendant's version of events, that this was an act of self-defense, that would only justify maybe the first cut. That doesn't justify the 16 additional cuts and stab wounds that followed. This is not a case of self-defense, ladies and gentlemen. So the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed attempted first-degree murder. Now, count 2 is burglary. To prove the crime of burglary, the state must prove 2 elements to you beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that Austin Walker had permission or consent to enter a structure or conveyance owned by or in the possession of Barbara Walker. Second, that Austin Walker, entering the structure or conveyance, remained therein surreptitiously and with the intent to commit murder, attempted murder, aggravated battery, or aggravated assault inside the structure or conveyance. Now, the judge is also going to instruct you that if a defendant exceeds the scope of their license or invitation, then their license or invitation is no longer valid. The court's also going to instruct you that you can infer that he had the intent to commit a crime when he entered into the structure if the entry was done stealthily and without the consent of the owner or occupant. So let's talk about the first element. We know that the defendant had permission to be in the home up until 10 p.m. because there was a time-sharing agreement in place which allowed him to be with the children until 10 p.m. We know that the home was in the possession of Barbara Walker. It was in her custody and control because she was the one that paid all of the utilities. She was also the primary user of the residence. The defendant was living in Miami with his own place, and then when he would come up to Jacksonville, he did not stay with Barbara and the kids. He stayed at another residence. So ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, that this element is in place. Element number 2 is that he entered with the intent to commit a crime. Now, ladies and gentlemen, surreptitious by its very definition means secretive. And when he entered into the residence, nobody knew that he was entering back into the residence. AJ watched him leave. AJ saw, you heard his testimony that he saw his dad go to the truck. But he came back into that home. So he entered stealthily, and he entered so that nobody would know that he was back there. He wanted everybody to believe that he had left the house that day. When he entered back into the house, he had that knife on him, which shows that he had the intent to commit some sort of violent crime against Barbara or one of the children inside of the house. The defendant knew that he was not supposed to be there. He told the detectives during his interview that he knew he wasn't supposed to be there. He told you today that he knew that his time-sharing agreement ended at 10 p.m. and that he was supposed to leave at that point. The defendant exceeded the scope of the license of his invitation once that 10 p.m. mark left. He stayed on that property, he never left the property, and he went back into that house with the intent to kill Barbara. Ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to be instructed that if you find that Austin Walker is guilty of burglary, you must find whether or not this was a dwelling. Now, a dwelling is a building of any kind which has a roof over it and is designed to be occupied by people lodging therein at night. Ladies and gentlemen, you saw the photos. You know for a fact that this is a house. You heard the testimony from Barbara and the kids that this was their home, this is where they stayed, this is where they slept. Ladies and gentlemen, it's as simple as that. That home was a dwelling. You're also going to be instructed on whether or not during the course of committing the burglary, the defendant committed an assault on any person. And an assault is an intentional and unlawful threat, either by word or act, to do violence to another person that would have created a well-founded fear in the other person that violence was about to take place. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just that. The defendant pulled out a knife on Barbara, put that knife to her neck, poked her in the chest with that knife. That was an assault that the defendant committed on Barbara, creating a well-founded fear that something was going to happen. You're also going to be instructed instructed that if you find him guilty, you are also to determine whether or not during the course of the burglary he battered somebody in the home. And a battery is an actual and intentional touching or striking of another person against their will, or the intentional causing of great bodily harm. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've made it pretty clear about the attempted murder. I understand that it's an attempted murder, but each stabbing action, each cut that he made was an intentional touching and striking of Barbara. In addition to that, you have the action that the defendant took when he entered the laundry room. He grabbed Barbara around the waist, pulled her close to him, took her cell phone away from him. That is a battery. You also have where he carried her, turned her around, and carried her out of the laundry room in a bear hug fashion. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you find that the defendant did commit a battery while he was inside the residence. The last count is aggravated assault. Now, an aggravated assault has 4 elements to it to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The first is that he intentionally and unlawfully threatened, either by word or act, to do violence to Brenda Walker. At the time, he appeared to have the ability to carry out the threat. The act of Austin Walker created in the mind of Barbara Walker a well-founded fear that violence was about to take place and that the assault was made with a deadly weapon. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to pay attention to the first element, because I anticipate the defense is going to tell you, well, he never made any threats to her. He never said anything to her to threaten her life. But this is very clear that it's either word or act. And his actions are what would have caused that threat of violence to Barbara. Taking that knife, poking it against her chest, putting that knife up to her neck. That in and of itself is an intentional and unlawful threat to do violence to Barbara. The second element is that at the time he appeared to have the ability to carry out the threat. Poking that knife and putting that up to somebody's throat, that is more than apparent having the ability to carry out that threat. The third element of creating a well-founded fear that violence was about to take place. Now, the judge is also going to instruct you as part of that element that if an ordinary, reasonable person would have believed that violence was about to take place, that is sufficient for you to find. We know from the children's testimony that Barbara sounded scared, that she kept pleading with the defendant to stop, to let her go, to leave the house. Of course, an ordinary, reasonable, prudent person is going to have a well-founded fear in their mind that violence is about to take place when somebody is holding a knife to them and they are having to plead with that person to stop. The fourth element is that an assault was made with a deadly weapon. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's a knife. It's been called a lot of things over the last 2 days. We've heard it be called a hunting knife, a survival knife, a tactical knife, a butcher knife. That doesn't change the fact that it is what it is, and that is a knife, and it is a very large knife that is a deadly weapon. So ladies and gentlemen, we have proven to you all 4 counts of aggravated assault beyond a reasonable doubt. We've talked a lot about reasonable doubt, but I'm sure you guys don't actually know entirely what that is. A reasonable doubt is not a mere possible doubt, a speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Such doubt must not influence your verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. And in determining what is reasonable, the judge is going to instruct you on different things that you can weigh and consider that you heard over the course of the last several days. And you use your common sense to decide what is reasonable. One of these things, I'm going to just highlight a couple of them. There's going to be several of them on your instructions. One of them is, did the witness seem to have the opportunity to see or know the things about which the witness testified? Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering the attorney's questions? And does the testimony agree with the evidence and testimony of the other items in the case? So let's talk about each of these, but I'm primarily going to focus on agreeing with the testimony. You heard testimony from Barbara, the kids, that both kids actually, that the defendant was holding her in a bear hug. Their stories were consistent in that the defendant came back into the home. AJ and Barbara both told you that they ran into the defendant in the laundry room after both kids came out to tell her that the father was gone. So both kids, AJ tells you that. Barbara also confirms that when she walks into the house, the defendant is standing there. AJ and Barbara also both told you that the defendant tried to take her cell phone away from you. In fact, the defendant himself also told you that he tried to take her cell phone away from her. They both then tell you, AJ and Barbara both tell you, that the defendant then grabs her by her waist, removes that phone from her, eventually spins her body around, and bear hug carries her out into the kitchen. At this point, you now have the testimony of Casey, AJ, and Barbara that is all consistent with each other. That the defendant was bear hug carrying her into the kitchen. The defendant sets her down in the kitchen. At some point, the defendant pulls out a knife from his pocket. And all three of them tell you that the defendant is the one that pulled out this knife. They all tell you that at some point the defendant drops the knife and he causes a cut to his own hand. It's at this point that Barbara tells AJ to run, as AJ runs out of the house. And all of them have told you the same thing. They then tell you, after AJ leaves, that Katrina, the neighbor, comes over to the house. You got to hear Katrina's testimony as well, where Katrina told you that AJ came over, he was frantic, and so she went over to check on everything. And it was at that point that the defendant answered the door and said everything was fine. Katrina testified and told you, and so did Casey, that Barbara said everything was not fine. And you got to hear Katrina tell you kind of the sound and the noise that was made when Barbara said she was not okay. She described it and explained it for you as a high-pitched noise. And all of them have said the same thing. They then testified that the door got slammed in Katrina's face, and it was at that point that the defendant went over, because Barbara had tried to run away at this point. Casey and Barbara both told you that she tripped over the chair, fell to her knees, and it was at that point that the defendant yelled at the kids to go to their room. He then walked over to Barbara, grabbed her by her hair, and slit her throat. Now, Casey told you that she couldn't see exactly what was happening because their backs were to them, which was the same thing that Barbara told you as well. But Casey described it as a smiley face. She said he kind of curved the knife like a smiley face. And that's consistent with the photos of the injuries that we have of Barbara, that it kind of goes up, just like Casey described it. Now, the kids said at this point they're in their room, and Barbara says that the attack continues. And we know that Barbara's testimony is consistent with the other evidence given the number of injuries she has. She testified and told you that after the first several stabs, the defendant called his father and told his father that he had just killed Barbara. And then you hear from Randall. Randy told you that he got a call from his son saying, "I just killed Barbara." You then got to hear Randall's 911 call that was made just minutes after his phone conversation with the defendant, where he says, "My son just called me and said he killed his wife." Ladies and gentlemen, their stories are consistent with each other. Their statement is consistent with their own stories, with the other stories, and with all of the other evidence. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the one that was right before about, was a witness honest and straightforward with you in answering the attorney's questions? The defense wants you to believe that everybody's lying. None of them are being honest with you. Specifically the children. The children aren't being honest. There was a lot of illusion yesterday during questioning that the children weren't telling you the truth. The defendant testified that the children were being coached. He believed the children were being coached. Ladies and gentlemen, is this reasonable? Is it reasonable that all of these people have the same consistent stories from their perspectives and their viewpoints, but the children are being coached? Is it reasonable that the children had such an emotional response when law enforcement got them out of that house and they were sitting with the police officers in the patrol car? Those children were hysterical, ladies and gentlemen. Those children did not have time to fabricate some sort of story about what they saw happen inside that house. How would that even be possible? Because based on all of the testimony that you have, even the defendant's own statements are that Barbara was lying on the ground, bleeding, after she had been stabbed. But the kids are in their bedroom. The kids are away from them. The kids don't know what's actually happening now out in the kitchen, out in the rest of the house. But yet the kids come out of that house saying, "Daddy's trying to kill Mommy." Daddy cut mommy. How can the children possibly be coached? How is it even remotely possible that they could be making all of this up? Because it's not, ladies and gentlemen. It is not reasonable. Both kids also sat up here on the stand yesterday, and they both told you that they were telling you the truth. They told you that they told the truth back then, and they told you they're telling you the truth now. These children have no reason to lie to you about what they saw. Barbara has no reason to lie to you about how she sustained 17 different stab wounds. Randy is the defendant's own father. Why would Randy lie about what his son was doing if it wasn't true? Ladies and gentlemen, what's more reasonable is that these children witnessed something absolutely horrific, that Barbara went through something horrific. Not everyone here can possibly be lying to you. The only person's testimony that doesn't add up with everybody else's is the defendant's. It just doesn't make any sense. During his interview, you heard that he was able to talk to the detectives freely, told the detectives everything, kind of leading up to it. But then he blacks out, and he tells the detective he doesn't know what happened. But now today, sitting up on this witness stand, he remembers everything that happened. He's able to tell you exactly what happened. Barbara had the knife. Barbara threatened me with the knife. Barbara pulled the knife out on me. Barbara cut me. If that's the way that had all happened, he would have told that detective, Detective Johnston, back in 2022 when this actually happened. But instead, he told her that he blacked out. That's because this was not an accident. This was not something where he blacked out. This was not a case of self-defense. He was not being honest and straightforward with you in answering the questions today. Instead, he intended to cause the death of Barbara Walker. Ladies and gentlemen, this man sounds like he really loves his kids, and he cares about his kids based on what he's saying, based on his reaction in the interview, and the number of times that he brought them up. But he loved them so much that he took a knife out and put a knife to what he described as a phenomenal mother right in front of his children. And then he cut her throat in front of them. And while they were still sitting in the house, he continued to stab her. Ladies and gentlemen, the only just verdict in this case is guilty of attempted first-degree murder, guilty of burglary with an assault or battery, and guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Thank you.
This isn't about money. This isn't about kids. This is about control. He was losing control. And just like Miss Adams said, she took everything from me. She took my money, she took my kids, she took my father. He was losing control, and he needed to get it back. And in fact, today, he did one last ditch effort and took that stand today and tried to get control back. And what did he say? Everything is Barbara's fault. Everything she said is a lie. Even the most minute, inconsequential facts she's lying about. He then would not agree that his children were lying on the stand. No, it's not his children's fault. They're not liars. It's Barbara's fault. Barbara coached them. She made them say that today. And when he was asked about the threatening messages, all of the text messages, when specific ones were read to him, what did he say? Oh, she's exaggerating. She has no reason to be scared. That's not a threat. He's saying she was not afraid of him. She has no reason to be afraid of him, although she has phones set up around the house, even though they have to come in different doors. Oh, she's exaggerating. She's not afraid of me. He even stated that she's lying that he went back to Miami that night. That she's lying that she looked at her phone on her GPS and saw him in Miami. Why would he say she's lying about that? You know why? because he came back to Jacksonville in the middle of the night and hid in her house and lied in wait, waiting for her. He tried to attack her back in March, and just like Ms. Adams said, his father is the one that prevented it from happening. His own father even admitted that he was so angry and beside himself that he was afraid of what would happen to Barbara if she was still in that house. The defense got up here and argued that you can't believe Katrina Freeman because everything she said was wrong. She said that she didn't see kids in the house, that the lights were on, etc. Katrina said she saw the lights on the outside of the house. She didn't see the kids because remember the testimony was he just opened the door a crack and the bench is behind the door. Additionally, she's lying because it wasn't a butcher knife. Ladies and gentlemen, this may not be a butcher knife, but it is a large knife. She can call it whatever she wants. It's a knife. Defense said that, or rather during his testimony, he stated that after she yelled at Katrina, that he went over to her and was like, "Why are you yelling like that?" That's how he responded. The same person that we saw in that stand earlier today, who was getting agitated, who was getting upset, who had a smart answer for everything you said, he that day was just calm, cool, and collected and approached her and was like, "Why did you do that?" That doesn't make any sense. Defense said that she was the one that attacked him. He took that stand and said she attacked him. Barbara said she was so scared when he grabbed her that she wet herself. Why would somebody get on the stand and lie about something like that? The defense got up here and said that Casey never talked about the knife before, that it's just something that she made up, that Barbara coached her to say. That 11-year-old girl took that stand and remembers so vividly what he did to her mother that she remembers it was in a happy face. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just for the sake of argument, let's say that you believe what the defense is arguing, that it was a heat of passion and that it's an attempted second-degree murder. Even if you believe that he entered that house with the knife, and at that time he had no intent to kill her, let's say for the sake of argument that he just entered the house and he wanted to scare her. He wanted to rough her up a little bit and threaten her. After he slit her throat and he continued for 40 minutes to stab her and cut her over and over again, second degree is out the window. He absolutely had the conscious intent to kill her at that time. For 40 minutes, he circled around that counter and he cut her and stabbed her. And then he contemplated. He'd look out the window for a few minutes and he'd go sit on the bench and he'd sit and he'd contemplate. He'd come back and stand over her body. And you remember when he was asked a question about standing over her, he made some comment about, "Yeah, I knew she was alive because she was still talking." That was his response when his wife was lying on the floor bleeding out. He stood over her body, saw that she was still breathing, saw that she was still alive, and continued to cut and stab her. That's how you know that he intended to kill her. Ladies and gentlemen, Barbara testified yesterday that she hadn't been showing a lot of emotion because she had to be strong for her 4 kids. Barbara has been strong through this entire thing, and she took that stand yesterday and told you all about the most horrific event of her life. And now, as I conclude here, justice is in your hands. And the state asks that you find this defendant guilty of all charges.